thank you very much. I watched all 14 minutes, and I would urge everybody to do the same, of you on your feet in Parliament yesterday, tearing absolute strips off the committee, tearing absolute strips off the report itself. Why didn't more people turn up and vote against it?
Well, because the vote was a foregone conclusion, that the opposition was all going to vote against Boris because it was fundamentally political. Gets wrapped up as if it's judicial and if it's a fair inquiry. It's not, it's politics. And once you have the opposition against Boris and the Boris haters within the Conservative Party, of whom there are sadly too many, then Boris was always bound to lose almost whatever the report had said. And 118 Conservatives voted against Boris yesterday, but bear in mind 148 Conservatives voted against him in the vote of no confidence a year ago. So in some ways his numbers are better now than they were last year.
Well, I'm not surprised, and the latest polling shows that he is more popular than Rishi Sunak, and I can't help but wonder whether or not the Conservative Party have just committed Harry Carey.
Well, if we did it last year, and now we are where we are. But yes, when Boris Johnson left the Prime Ministership, the Tories were a few points behind in the opinion polls, and now we're about 20 points behind in the opinion polls. So you see the cause and effect, that Boris is a popular national figure who connects with voters, and getting rid of him was a mistake. But all Conservatives watching this today must rally round Rishi Sunak, because we don't want a Keir Starmer government.
Well, talk to me a bit about Harriet Harman. Now, Harriet Harman appeared to be absolutely loving it yesterday, and from what I can gather, Jacob, there is now going to be an inquiry into the inquiry. We have a cost of living crisis, mortgage rates, massive concern, migrant crisis, both legal and illegal, NHS waiting times at record levels, not enough school places. I could go on. And yet the people locked in that Westminster bubble seem to think that the British public want more Partygate, want more inquiries. They need to get out more or ship off, don't they?
Well, the inquiry into the inquiry is entirely self-indulgent. It's an inquiry into how the poor dears were offended because people criticised their committee. As a matter of freedom of speech, you must be entitled to criticise parliamentary committees. And dare I say, you must be free to criticise MPs. And there may even be some people who want to criticise me, and you may think that's deeply shocking, but it's their democratic, free speech right. And you're allowed to criticise Harriet Harman too, and say she shouldn't have chaired that committee, and will she please name the member of the government who said it was all right for her to be the chairman of that committee? Because I can tell you the Prime Minister at the time didn't know this was the case.
Yes, expand on this, because you were actually Chris Bryant, who's always good value, in a way, did decide to try to take you at task yesterday and say, well, did you raise at the time that Harriet Harman, a woman who had openly expressed that she thought Boris Johnson was a liar before she was asked to sit on a panel and decide whether or not Boris Johnson was a liar, whether or not she should have been removed from this panel? And you said, yes, you had called for that. So just explain, as you understand how on earth that happened. Go on.
Well, I said it in a number of interviews. I was more than happy to say it publicly to people who asked me, that I thought she should have done the same as Chris Bryant, who behaved very properly in this circumstance. But Harriet Harman herself said that the government had said it was all right for her to carry on. But she didn't specify who in the government said this. And I think in the interests of transparency, she needs to confess and say who it was and whether this person was actually speaking for the government or not.
Now, Jacob, you hit some really key points, which I'm going to ask you to explain again for me, really, here, which is that a fixed penalty notice, which has caused such a hoo-ha for Boris, is not an admission of guilt. You also appeared to say that that report, in relation to Harriet Harman, for example, was quite quiet about the issue of bias as well. And you hit a couple of other really key points in your 14 minutes. Well, would you mind doing a job of kind of tying this up in a neat little bow for us, really, for people who haven't actually had the pleasure of seeing you on the floor of the Commons?
Well, very, very simply, the committee always took the blackest view of anything Boris had said or done. It assumed a fixed penalty notice was a confession of guilt, which the Lord Chief Justice specifically said it wasn't in a court judgment. It also presumed to know what Boris was thinking at one particular time, and it was unaware of what ministers were being told in relation to what we were supposed to say about the parties, what the official line was from officials. All of that they ignored because they were determined to find him guilty. And in Annex 1, where they say we're going to answer all Boris's points in his letter, they ignore the point about the partiality of the chairman of the committee. So while saying that Boris was disingenuous and he didn't tell the truth, they're not necessarily as straightforward and as transparent as they claim they would like to have been.
And going forward, what this could potentially mean is a precedent where an MP now could mislead Parliament knowingly or not. The intention may be inferred rather than proven, and they can be ejected and presumably never allowed to roam freely through the corridors of Westminster again. I suspect that that will lead to less accountability in Parliament, and frankly, it's bad for democracy because people will be too afraid to stand up and actually say anything in the House of Commons. Instead, later on, they are judged by someone who already thinks they are a liar to have misled the House.
I think that's right. I think more ministers will say, I will write to answer that question. I think that the previous practice, where if you were advised by officials, it was accepted that that was an honest mistake, and the committee decided to apply its own interpretation to what they thought Boris meant by things that he said, which seems to me to be really stretching the point in terms of whether something is accurate or inaccurate. Surely it's what the person meant when he said it, not your interpretation of it. The good news is, if there is any, is that Parliament cannot bind its successors. So if the voters send Boris Johnson back to Parliament, then this report is a dead letter.
Go on, explain that to me then. So if Boris Johnson stands for election again at some point in the future, what does that mean?
That means this report is completely irrelevant. They've taken away his pass as a visitor, but if he were returned to Parliament as an MP, this report becomes completely irrelevant. Dead letter, no significance. Fortunately, our fundamental constitutional right to send to Parliament whoever we like is unaffected by this self-serving report.
You know him better than most. Will he?
I hope so. To be perfectly honest, I don't think he's decided. But I think he remains a great national figure with huge popularity amongst Conservative voters.
You also made another key point yesterday, Jacob, which stood out for me, which was about the idea that Boris Johnson was parroting the advice that he was given by aides and communication staff whilst he was in the House of Commons. And that was government and ministerial-wide advice. So the idea that Boris was standing there on his own, essentially lying to Parliament, is in itself not really true. But the committee didn't look at that, is that right? They didn't look at whether or not Boris Johnson, a Prime Minister who, like I imagine most ministers, relies on communication advisers and advisers in general at times, was merely parroting what they were telling him to say.
And this is really important because before Prime Minister's questions, and for me as Leader of the House before business questions, you would have a file of papers an inch thick. And you were able to rely on those as being what the official position of the government was on every issue you cared to mention. Covered almost everything, anything anyone was likely to ask you about. You couldn't, of course, know that personally from your own investigation and your own detailed knowledge. And I, as Leader of the House, was given the very clear line to take from officials that the rules were followed at all times. That was the government-wide position. That would have been checked by officials. Officials are very conscious of the rules of misleading the House of Commons, and it's therefore something ministers could reasonably rely on. Did the Privileges Committee ask other ministers what briefing they'd been given? No, of course not, because they wanted to come to a particular judgment.
Now, just lastly, Jacob, Theresa May is the MP for Maidenhead. Maidenhead's local council has just gone Liberal Democrat, and there has been a really conspicuous vacuum of silence from Theresa May in the face of a lot of local residents being up in arms over their largest local hotel being commandeered for use as an asylum seeker hotel. There are planning issues there as well. My point is this: within Theresa May's own constituency, she doesn't appear to be doing very much. But she found the time yesterday to come to Parliament to applaud Harriet Harman and to stick the stiletto into Boris Johnson. A word for her?
Well, actually, I think you're being a bit unfair on her. I think she is a very assiduous constituency MP. but I think she took the view that revenge is a dish best served cold.
OK, fair enough, Jacob. Look, thank you very, very much. Great to have you on. And, of course, you will, I believe, anyway, be gracing our televisions later on. Jacob Rees-Mogg, everybody.
I'm back, yes. Yes, I'm sorry I wasn't with everybody yesterday, but I'm back at 8 to 9 o'clock this evening.
Well, there you go. I mean, it's going to be a must-watch. Jacob Rees-Mogg. So there we go, a fellow GB News presenter and, of course, a Conservative MP.